Right, I don't know if anybody is there, but if anybody is there, we are now online. We'll start the webinar in a few minutes. If you are online, please set up the chat facility, which there'll be a button in the top right or top left of your screen. Please click on that and then we can communicate by chat. I think we have one viewer at the moment. Someone has signed on. So if you have signed on, do feel free to send me a chat message. The chat button, I think, is in the top right or top left of your screen. If you can enable chat, then you can just send me a short note and then I'll know you're there. Ooh, several viewers. Great. Trevelyan is there. Fantastic. Excellent. Good start. Hello to our Danish colleagues who are joining us from Brussels. We have several people signed up from other non-UK countries today, so we'll see how many of them actually managed to make it online. Great. I hope everybody can see me or hear me. I am talking, you can see my lips moving. If you can't hear me, then please do let me know. I'm not sure I can do much about it, to be honest, but obviously important. Sunny downtown Stoke-on-Trent is with us. So Manchester, Stoke-on-Trent and Brussels so far. Great. So there's 6 attendees, but so far only 2 people have told me they're there. So hopefully other people will join shortly. And we'll start in a couple of minutes. Don't want to start too late because this seminar, the webinar, there's a lot to get through on this one. This is the long one, so this one goes for about an hour and a half. So this will go from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. UK time, or 2 to 3:30 Brussels time, as far as I know. You can see you can hear me. I do apologize, there may be a slight hum in the background. My computer seems to have developed a slight hum, which I'm trying to get sorted at the moment, but I haven't been able to do so far. So I do apologize if there is a hum in the background. Slovakia is there too. Great. Oh, countries are signing up all over Europe. It's fantastic. The true spirit of the European Union. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Somebody else has just joined us. If you've just joined us, please do try and find your chat button, which I think is in the top right or the top left. I'm never quite sure which one. And send me just a short note to say that you are online. That would be great, so I know who is here and who may yet be joining us. Right, I'll just give it another 30 seconds or so and then we will start, because I do want to make sure we get through everything we have to get through today. I hope everybody also received the text that I sent this morning. I apologize, it was sent a little later than it should have been, but I hope people have got that. And North Devon is also online. Fantastic. So delightful parts of the UK, Devon and Stoke-on-Trent are with us, and we also have Brussels and Kosice in Slovakia with us. And there should be a few more as well, but maybe they will join in due course. Okay, what I'm going to do is I am going to start the webinar. I hope other people will join in as we continue. Can I just say there's a slide which says this in a second, but just while I can't see you, but you can probably see me. Can I just stress that the only way you can communicate with me on this particular webinar program is if you send me a chat message. So if you have a question or a comment or anything at all, send me a chat message. Now, the issue about chat messages is that I cannot see them once I start displaying the PowerPoint presentations. But what I will do is I'll stop every 5 or 10 slides and I'll go back to check for chat messages. So your chats will get through to me and I will address them as we go through. Obviously, there'll be time at the end for you to submit other questions via the chat facility. So I hope all that makes sense. We seem to be having it's all going fairly smoothly so far. Let's hope that continues. Right, I'm going to launch straight into the PowerPoint presentation. So what you should now be able to see is the first slide of the PowerPoint presentation, and the text I sent you earlier on today has everything that's on these slides is on that document that you've been sent by email. That's the overview. This is the agenda. What we're going to look at today is a bit of background. We're going to look at the summary of the structural funds and the Interreg program, quick summary of the external actions, and there'll be a short break, very short break, a minute or so, and a quick summary of the transnational funds. I keep saying quick summary because this is only an hour and a half, whereas, you know, these seminars to go into all the detail will take all day. And as you know, there are individual webinars for about an hour on each of the individual transnational funds. So this is very much an overview of the funding opportunities for arts, culture, heritage, creative industries, and so on. So you're going to get breadth, but not necessarily a great deal of depth on this particular overview. How to interact. This slide is there. To be honest, these days we only use the chat button. That's the one that's easiest to use. And as I said, if you have a question, just send me a chat message and I will look at the chat buttons every so often to make sure that everybody is still with me. A little bit of background to start with. There are two key documents that you need to have some awareness of if you're thinking about European funding. I mean, there are thousands of European Commission documents, but the two most important ones, in my view, the treaty and the mission statement. This is the article in the European Union treaties which talks about culture. Article 167, culture first made it into any treaty in 1992, 40 years after the whole thing started, so it took them a while. Very carefully worded, the flowering of the cultures of the member states, respecting national and regional diversity. Do remember, of course, that culture is not an official responsibility of the European Union. It's the responsibility of the member states to decide what arts and culture they support and how they do that. The European Union has very carefully constrained responsibilities in this area, which means that most of their support goes to projects involving a number of different member states. This is something the member states themselves do not do, so the European Union can act in that particular area by providing support for projects involving partners from different countries. The phrase common cultural heritage is also there. In other words, the European Union can't tread on the toes of the member states, but maybe there is this common cultural heritage that the European Union can take responsibility for, something we share that goes beyond the individual nation-state boundaries and borders. Once upon a time, there was an interesting definition of what this meant, which I won't bother going into, but the key thing is there isn't a definition anymore. And if you are submitting an application to the European Union for funding, then there's some sort of interesting new interpretation of how your project is going to explore a new definition of common cultural heritage in the 21st century across Europe. That might be an interesting theme or concept or starting point to develop a project. So it's just picking on that particular phrase. It's quite an interesting one. I'm not going to go through these other clauses. They're fairly straightforward about cooperation and so on and so forth. Clause 4 is where the Commission is allowed to spend money on cultural projects out of its other budgets. So that's quite important, because that means the culture project can be funded through all the different programs and schemes of the European Union. That's enshrined in clause 4 of this article. The second key document is Europe 2020. This is the current mission statement. There's a 10-year mission statement from 2014 to 2020, and this sets out the priorities of the European Union for this period. There's nothing here that shrinks culture, and obviously those programs that are more closely aligned to these themes have much larger budgets. And you'll find that even within the culture program, there has been a requirement that the culture program starts to address some of these sorts of challenges. So these really are the underpinning themes that are governing the way in which the European Union is focusing and spending its money in the period leading up to 2020. Okay. Right, before we go on, I'm just very quickly going to go back and check to see whether anybody has had any problems, whether there are any chat messages that have come through. No, so I'm assuming if there's no chat messages, I will assume you have not only have no questions, but everything is going smoothly and you can see me and hear me and everything else under the sun. So we'll go back to the slides. Okay, a couple of practical things, the structures, links, who has responsibility for culture. The way the whole thing works is that there are 3 key institutions: the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. I'm not going to go into detail about these as well, just to point out that the body with which you will have most dealings is the Commission. Of course, the Commission is the bureaucracy that is responsible for allocating the funding and spending the Commission's budget on projects and programs. So the Commission is the key body for most people. The Parliament may be important if you happen to know any members of the European Parliament, but they don't give away money, but they do have an input into policy. So they are influencing policy decisions that are being made at the European level. And then finally is the European Council, which is the sort of heads of state, and the Council of Ministers, which is meetings every so often of the various ministers from the different member states in their own particular area. Ministers of Transport will meet, ministers of Defence will meet, ministers of Culture will also meet. There are various other committees, we're not going to worry about those. Important to note that the Commission these days is starting to set up a number of agencies to take responsibility for the day-to-day handling of grants and so on. The one which you're most likely to come across is the EACEA, Education, Audiovisual and Culture Executive Agency, commonly known as the agency, and this manages most of the grant programs in education, the audiovisual sector and culture. So in many cases you'll be dealing with the agency rather than actually directly with the Commission. Commissioners. This is the Commission is governed by a series of 28 commissioners, one from each member state. The current Commissioner for Education, Culture, Youth and Sport is Tibor Navracsics from Hungary. An interesting character, part of the current fairly right-wing government, I think it's fair to say, and former Deputy Prime Minister, I think, if I remember rightly. He's only just started. All these commissioners only started at the end of last year, so it's too early to say whether they're going to be wonderful or dreadful, but we will watch this space. I've listed all these other commissioners because just to point out that all these other commissioners have responsibilities for areas where money has been spent on culture. They may not be aware of that, but for example, if you look halfway down regional policy, well, that includes the ERDF, the European Regional Development Fund, which has spent a great deal of money on cultural projects over the years. Underneath that is the ESF fund, underneath that the Agriculture Fund, and so on. So all these different commissioners are responsible for budgets within which some money will have been spent on culture. So it's an interesting way in which the whole thing works. The European Parliament, just a sort of small point, but the European Parliament has a Culture and Education Committee, which is responsible for those particular areas there. You may want to check via that website. You can get a list of the different MEPs from the different countries who sit on the individual committee, so you can find out which MEPs from the UK, Denmark or Slovakia or wherever sit on this particular committee. In the UK, we are, I think, very lucky at the moment because we have a new MEP for the North West, representing the Labour Party, a woman called Julie Ward, who sits on the Culture Committee and who also happens to have a background in the arts. She has been running for many years a theatre company up in, funnily enough, not in the Northwest, but up in the Northeast, near between Newcastle and Durham. So it's very rare for anybody on the Culture Committee to have any experience in the arts at all. So this could be a good thing for the arts and culture sector. There are other committees available as well in other areas, but obviously the Culture and Education Committee may be the one that's most relevant. Okay, types of funding programs: structural funds, transnational funds, external actions. This is the simple summary. This is my summary, not necessarily quite the same way the European Union would see it. The structural funds are the funds that provide geographical support. So in other words, they pick the areas that are the most disadvantaged and they throw extra money at those areas so that those areas across Europe can get further investment to become better off economically, increase the sort of prosperity of the region and so on and so forth. The key thing about the structural funds is that in virtually every case, you do not need partners. This is not a partnership program. The structural funds are simply about spending money in a region to help that region. The transnational funds, on the other hand, are about partnerships. The transnational funds are where partners from different countries or organizations from different countries get together to run a project or to take part in some sort of mobility activity or whatever. But partnership is crucial. And then third group is the external actions, which is a group of programs which provide support for activities linking the European Union with countries in other parts of the world. Now, these are a bit complicated, I think it's fair to say. I'll very briefly go through them during this webinar, but it is a bit complicated. One important development as part of Europe 2020 is that the transnational funds have been invited to open up their project partnerships to countries outside Europe. So it is now much easier to apply for a transnational fund and involve a country outside the European Union. So rather than having to go through one of the external actions programs, if you want to involve a country in South America, you can now put them in as an additional partner into the transnational funds. There are restrictions on the amount of money that can be spent on these non-European partners, but it is a slightly easier way than perhaps going through the external action program, and I'll come to those as well. Just to remind us of the amounts of money that are involved here, we have the structural funds taking up the vast majority of the budget. Nearly 3/4 of the European Union budget goes on the structural funds. 15% goes on the transnational funds, about 6% on the external actions, and about 6% on the administration costs. So you can see that the structural funds is where most of the money goes, interestingly enough. The overall EU budget, just making a point, is that it's just less than 1% of the GDP, the gross domestic product, of all the member states of the European Union. So it's a relatively tiny budget compared to what the member states are spending themselves, and obviously, rightly, on their own budgets in whatever government areas they have to. The EU budget is a relatively modest amount. Okay, right, just very quickly, and once again, before we start, we'll go on to the next section. I'm just going to check once again to see if there are any questions. No questions, good. I will go straight back into the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to rattle through the structural funds first of all. Structural funds. Just a quick summary of the differences between the structural funds and the transnational funds. The structural funds, the geographical focus, as I said, focusing on a particular region or sub-regional area. Transnational, pan-European focus. The structural funds, you do not need partners except for the Interreg program. So you do need partners for the Interreg program. I'll explain that in a moment. Transnational funds, partners are essential. So partnership in some way is essential. So that's not a key difference. The structural funds, interestingly, all that 73% of the budget is devolved. the money is not allocated in Brussels. The money of the structural funds is given back to the member states. So the money is given back to the member states, and organisations within the member states, which could be government departments or other agencies they appoint, are involved in making the decisions about how that money is spent. It's not the faceless bureaucrats in Brussels, it's the faceless bureaucrats in London or Copenhagen or Bratislava or wherever it happens to be that are making these decisions about these European funds. On the other hand, the transnational funds, most of these decisions are in fact centralised. So people do make contact with the European Commission in terms of submitting their applications. You know, wherever you are in Europe, you'll submit your application to the European Commission or the agency in Brussels. The structural funds have large funds to be accessed, not just because they have 73% of the European Union budget, but because they can spend money on quite large-scale projects. So they can invest in capital works, roads and buildings and seafronts and all sorts of things, bridges, or they can invest in people-based activities, skills development, training, capacity building, if that's going to help economic development. It's all about economic development, growth, jobs, so on and so forth. The transnational funds focus on short-term projects, small to medium-sized grants, a wide range of activities. They're a lot more flexible within the transnational funds, different themes and ideas and goals and so on, although they are all expected to link in some way to the Europe 2020 agenda. Okay, so structural funds. In summary, there are funds and then mechanisms to spend the funds. The funds are the ERDF and ESF and so on, which I'll explain in a moment. And the way in which the funds are spent, there are essentially two mechanisms. There is the mechanism based on the category of economic status of the particular region. So they're classified into less developed, transition, or more developed. And the other mechanism is the Interreg program. So two mechanisms, one based on economic status and the other based on the Interreg program. And both of those spend those funds, ERDF, ESF, and so on. Okay, the key goal of the structural funds is to reduce regional disparities in terms of income, wealth, and opportunities. The various funds, there are 5 funds. The Cohesion Fund does not apply to the UK. It is a Southern Mediterranean countries fund. But the other funds, ERDF, ESF, Agriculture Fund, Fisheries Fund, all of those apply everywhere in Europe, and many people will have heard of those. The ERDF is focused on growth and infrastructure. The ESF is focused on people. Obviously, agriculture and maritime are focused on those particular areas. So those are the funds that are spent within the structural funds programs. The mechanisms, here we have the less developed, the transition regions and the more developed regions. And you'll see that the less developed regions, some or all of Eastern European and Balkan countries, some of Greece, Italy, Spain, most of Portugal. And then the transition regions, there are parts of most member states. There are none whatsoever in Austria, Cyprus, Finland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Sweden. And then the more developed regions is everywhere else. And as I said earlier, these funds are allocated by ministries or agencies in the individual member states at a national or regional level. And the bottom row there talks about the European Territorial Cooperation, the Interreg program. We're now up to Interreg 5, and there are a range of different mechanisms, sub-mechanisms to spend that money, and different sub-strands, and for each of those sub-strands there'll be a separate secretariat. So the main structural funds are spent via the member states, and the Interreg program is spent via a range of Interreg secretariats. I'll explain more about this as we go through, but just to understand that. This is the map of Europe, which explains or shows you, which regions are getting what. The dark red are the less developed regions, so the worst off bits of Europe are, you can see there as Eastern European countries, Greece, southern Italy, bit of Spain, most of Portugal, and you'll see that there are, interestingly, just 2 other red regions in the rest of Western Europe, and both of those are in the United Kingdom. Even the Republic of Ireland no longer has any less developed or even transition regions. So it is interesting that there are still these pockets of deprivation in the United Kingdom and in many other countries as well that are therefore in receipt of the structural funds. The general information about European funding, these are some websites provided by the European Commission. InfoRegio, which gives you information about regional policy, which includes ERDF. There's some case studies, ERDF case studies there. There are some ESF case studies. And the DG for Education, Audiovisual and Culture also has some case studies of some of these some projects funded under these programs as well, projects in the cultural area. So there are some examples there. And if you're a Connexus member, we have a couple of documents you can download which provide project examples of culture projects funded by these funds. What can be supported? If you go back to the documents produced by the European Commission, you'll see that they do state quite clearly that ERDF and ESF can provide support for a range of cultural activities. These are some of the sort of statements that they have made. There is absolutely nothing to stop ERDF and ESF being spent on culture, with the proviso that the culture or the projects must produce some sort of clear economic development or other outputs that are relevant to the objectives of these particular structural funds, which are about jobs and growth. Here is a typical example of ERDF funding, which was converting the old Waterford Manufacturing Centre in Ireland into a manufacturing and visitor centre. And this is quite often ERDF money is spent on these sorts of conversion projects, creating visitor attractions, where the argument is that these visitor attractions will attract more people to come visit the region, spend more money on hotels and restaurants and so on and so forth, and therefore provide economic benefit. You'll see that there was nearly 3 million euros of ERDF went into this particular project. This is another example of a slightly different type of ERDF funding. This was Abertay University in Dundee in Scotland, where they put money into video games projects. So they got just over 1 million euros for ERDF to put into their funding program for video games, prototypes, and so on. So this is it's not just about converting old buildings. It can be about other projects which are going to help develop economic outputs and opportunities. This is a typical ESF project, the artwork project, £700,000 worth of funding to help NEETs. Now, NEETs is the UK abbreviation. It means not in education, employment, or training. So this is for young people who are not in education, employment, or training, in other words, disadvantaged one way or another. And this money went to help them find jobs, give them additional skills and capacity, and so on. Okay, the allocation in the UK, we have some UK people here. So just to make sure it's clear that what happens in the UK is that there is a split of regions. You can see the split there. And the money in the UK is allocated via various agencies. In England, it is the Local Enterprise Partnerships, the LEPs. In Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it's different agencies. This is on the following slide. And then, as I said before, for the Interreg program, there are different secretariats for each of the sub-strands. So just to put this into detail, for the UK, devolution, money comes from the EU to the UK, to the English regions and Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There are 9 English regions, and there used to be 9 RDAs, Regional Development Associations, but there are now 39 LEPs, Local Enterprise Partnerships. It's not quite clear who's giving the money away in Scotland, apart from the Scottish Government. Wales, there's an organisation called WEFO, and there are various organisations in Northern Ireland. In England, if you're interested in England, then if you're in Devon or Stoke, or wherever you are, you need to make contact with your local enterprise partnership. There's a website coming up which will tell you how to find them. There is a LEP network website where you can find who your local LEP is. They have responsibility for helping to allocate these funds. There are some additional UK websites there for ERDF, ESF, and the Agriculture Programme. RDPE is the Rural Development Programme for England. How does it work? And this, although I'm talking about the UK here, but it's a very similar model in all countries. There is a national operational programme. So for each of the funds, ERDF and ESF, there will be an operational programme which takes the objectives and priorities of the structural funds and the objectives and priorities of the government, in this case the UK, puts them together and produces an operational programme. The devolved agencies, either the LEPS or the Scottish Government, WIFO and so on, also produce a European Structural Investment Fund strategy which sets out the priorities in their particular location. So, there will obviously be different priorities in London as opposed to the Highlands of Scotland. So there will be different ESIF for different regions of Scotland. So there'll be one for Devon and there'll be one for the area around Stoke and so on and so forth. However, those are guidance documents. The LEPs don't actually handle applications for funding. Just to make life complicated, the applications for funding are made centrally via a managing agency, but those applications, although they're submitted centrally, will then be considered by committees that take into account the ESIF for the region from which you've made your application. So although the application may be made, will be considered centrally, if the application comes from Devon, they will look at the LEP strategy for Devon and consider whether the application meets the criteria in that strategy. So it's a good idea for you to find out what's in the strategy that's been written by your local enterprise partnership if you're in England. Applicants need to find their own match funding. Just to add to the challenges, or actually this is an opportunity rather than a challenge, there is, for the ESF fund, there is an opt-in route where some agencies have put in the match funding already. So you don't have to find the match funding if you apply directly to these agencies. The challenge, of course, is that these agencies have also added in their own criteria. So you have European criteria, UK criteria, LEP criteria, and perhaps the criteria of these agencies as well, such as the Skills Development Agency or the Big Lottery Fund or whoever. So it can be a bit challenging. And I will just say, just as a slightly depressing footnote, we have done some analysis of the operational programs and the ESIF strategies for the 39 LEPs, simply by checking how many times keywords appeared, which you might think would be relevant to the arts, culture, heritage, and creative industry sectors, and we discovered that the results were pretty pathetic. The most successful LEPs were Greater Birmingham and Solihull, Tees Valley and West of England. The worst LEPs were Thames Valley, Berkshire, York and North Yorkshire, and also Greater Lincolnshire and Greater Manchester, sadly. So culture doesn't fare very well in these operational programs and these ESIF strategies. But they are the documents that you will need to sort of, be familiar with when you start to have a conversation with your LEP about potential project opportunities in your region. Okay. Finally, in this area, I'm just going to say a few words about the Agricultural Fund. There is a focus now on rural regeneration. And if you look at Section 9 of this regulation, you'll see that talks about ways in which the agricultural funds can support cultural activity, leisure and culture services, restoration, upgrading of the cultural and natural heritage, social inclusion, reversing trends of social and economic decline, so on and so forth. So there are some opportunities to support culture projects here. And part of the Agricultural Fund is spent on the LEADER program, which are small-scale local projects organized by local action groups. And you may have the opportunity to approach a local action group to get a LEADER grant in order to do a small-scale project if you are based in a rural area. It's all a bit complicated. This also is in the hands of the LEP, although obviously the LEADER funding is devolved to the local action group, so you would need to talk to them if you're interested. Okay, that's the basic information. There are some examples of LEADER projects that were supported in the last round. So that's the basic information about the structural funds, excluding the Interreg program. So this is about ERDF, ESF, agriculture funds, and so on, spent through the various agencies and mechanisms in the member states. So I hope that sort of gives you some background. We're going to go on to the Interreg program, but before we do, I'm just once again going to pop back quickly to see if there are any additional questions. Right, okay, Trevelyan, how do we find out transition regions in the UK? I have given you the list. Which agencies regionally are in charge of specific transition region funding streams? Those are the local enterprise partnerships. So I think hopefully I have answered those questions. I would just add that having been to one of these webinars, if you sort of finish the webinar and then if you've still got questions, then obviously you can send me an email and I'll very happily speak to you about that via email. Right. Okay, so we're now back on the slideshow. I hope you're seeing the slideshow. Everybody seeing the slideshow? Just going to just double check that you are back. Sorry, just give me 1 second. I just want to make absolutely certain that everybody is seeing the slideshow. Yeah, okay. Right, we're back on the slideshow. So I'm going to look at the Interreg program. Interreg also, if you go back to the European Commission guidelines, also gives opportunities for arts, culture, heritage, and creative industries and so on within the Interreg program. So Interreg is also relevant to these sectors. We are now getting started on the Interreg 5 program. I mean, do remember that all these funding programs have just restarted. They work on a 7-year funding cycle in Brussels. So the new program started at the beginning of 2014. The structural funds and Interreg are 73% of the budget, so that means it always takes a bit longer for them to get going. So we're only just now starting to see calls for proposals being announced for any of the structural funds or the Interreg program. So you've not missed anything. The calls for proposals are only now just coming out. The transnational funds have been going. There have been calls in 2014, and we're now looking at calls in 2015. But the structural funds have taken a while to get going. There are 3 strands of the Interreg program: A, cross-border, B, transnational, and C, Interreg Europe. It's really only A and B that are relevant for projects. Okay, it's A and B that support projects. C supports exchange of information and sharing of good practice. I'll explain more in a moment, but it's Strand A and Strand B. And Strand A and Strand B have been set up to allow people to cooperate through different sorts of regional and cross-border groupings, which I will now explain. Strand A. So Strand A is where they've taken a map of Europe and they've coloured in wherever there's a border. So you'll see there's a border between France and Spain, and that's coloured in yellow or dark yellow. And the idea is that the regions on either side of the Franco-Spanish border are encouraged to cooperate together. So that's what Interreg Strand A is all about, cross-border cooperation. You'll see there are cross-border bits all over Europe. There's a cross-border between Denmark and Germany. There's a cross-border between Denmark and Sweden. There's a cross-border between Slovakia and Czech Republic. There's a cross-border between Slovakia and Austria, I think. Anyway, there are many, many cross-border opportunities. Each of these cross-border opportunities works individually. So every one of these little bits of colour all over this map have their own secretariat that you would apply to if you were in the right region. Okay, so you obviously have to be in the appropriate region before you can apply to one of these particular strands. So just looking more closely at the UK in a second, to give an example of that, I mean, there are 52, 53 separate sub-strands in Strand A. In the previous round, we expected them to be virtually the same as this strand. So, I'm just going to look at the UK as an example, but they all operate with the same broad overall goals and structures. And although this is slightly different from the standard structural funds insofar as in Interreg you are working across borders and therefore with partners, the overall objectives are the same. You still need to be, delivering projects which are going to have some sort of economic benefit and impact. Here in the UK, these are the only parts of the UK that are eligible. So Southern England, so Devon, you are certainly eligible. West Wales, a bit west of Scotland, and Northern Ireland are the only other regions eligible. So anywhere else, I'm afraid Stoke misses out, and other parts of the UK miss out. So if you are in Devon, however, you can participate in 2 cross-border strands. There is the France Channel strand, which is the blue bit of France and Southern England. And then there is the 2 Seas strand, which is the sort of bits of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and also the Southern England one. Okay, so those are the ones where you can participate. This is an example of the previous program, the France Channel program, just giving you some summary of the priorities. I'm not going to worry about that too much. So this is an example of projects. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of cultural projects supported through Strand A of the cross-channel program here in the south of England and France. I mean, a typical project, for example, was where the Brighton Festival got together with other cultural organisations in Brighton, and they looked across the channel and they latched onto Dieppe, a town in France, and they developed a whole series of cross-channel cultural tourism projects. So those are examples. And the first call for proposals for these strands is starting to come out even as we speak. Strand B, and I'll give you the websites and so on. I should have said I'll give you the websites in a moment for these programs. Strand B is another exciting map of Europe with lots of different sorts of colours indicating a whole set of different groupings. Now, these are not cross-border. These are a number of regional groupings, each regional groupings involving a number of countries. And the idea is you work within your regional grouping. It's a bit easier to see on this slide. So you'll see that at the top left-hand corner, Northwest Europe, that's the whole of the UK, Ireland, Northern France, West Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, Southern Netherlands. The North Sea area is all sort of regions around the North Sea, so the east of the UK, all of Denmark, the bottom western tip of Sweden, and so on. And you'll see various other, the second row, the third and fourth are 2 other areas, Atlantic coast and northern periphery, for which bits of the UK are eligible. I have no idea whether Stoke is eligible in the Atlantic coast area. Need to check on that. And at the bottom, you'll see some other regions where there are other opportunities for other countries. So Slovakia, as far as I'm aware, can fit into the East Central Europe and the Southeast Europe grouping. So there are, so most countries or regions, have a couple of these Strand 4B. And again, as I said, each one of these operates separately with their own secretariat, their own website, their own criteria, their own deadlines, and so on. And you apply to whichever individual secretariat you think might be relevant to you. So these are the ones that are relevant to the UK in the past: Northwest Europe, North Sea, Atlantic area, and also the Northern Periphery. This is an example of a project. I just picked that one out because I really liked the idea of popcorn horror. This is obviously focused on the creative industries, about training SMEs in innovation techniques and so on. And they developed, as part of this project, a smartphone app connecting horror film fans by streaming the best short horror films from around the world. What fun. So this sounded like an interesting project. They can be diverse. There has to be some economic impact and benefit and so on, but this was one example. Strand C, as I said, isn't about supporting projects, but it's about supporting initiatives which are going to help share good practice, bring people together to talk about new ideas and so on and so forth. So it may be worth looking at in terms of anything interesting in terms of knowledge and understanding, but it's not necessarily going to fund projects. This is the list of the websites, the overall websites where you can find links to the various strands. And I've given the websites for those strands relevant to the UK, but you can find the other strands relevant to the other countries by looking at the main websites given under A and B. And I've given some websites there for strand C as well, including the URBACT program, which is a particular initiative within strand C, which focuses on urban initiatives and so on. Okay. Right, before we go on to the external actions, I'm just going to stop again and go back and see whether there have been any additional questions here. No more questions on the Interreg program, so hopefully that was all clear. So, okay, I shall now go back. External actions. Okay, external actions. Right, the external actions, they cover three categories. Countries who are likely to join the EU, so in other words, those countries who have indicated they'd like to join, the pre-accession countries, these are known as. Other countries around the EU that are less likely to join, like North Africa or the Middle East or some of the old Soviet Union countries, and then the rest of the world. So those are the three categories. But as I said earlier, this is not about, this is not necessarily an easy road. And if you do want to find partners or involve people from some of these countries and other parts of the world, you may simply be better off adding them in as additional partners into a transnational application. I really don't think external action programs are the place to go if you suddenly thought it would be nice to work with somebody in South America, but I've got no idea who. This is really about sort of people who may have met somebody in South America a couple of years ago at some conference or festival or showcase event or whatever, and decided they would like to work with them, and this might be an opportunity. One of the key things for these programs is that actually some of the decision making has been devolved to the other countries. So, if there is money available for South America, then that money will be devolved to these countries. And what happens is the European Commission office in those countries is your first stopping point to find out what's going on. The EU has an office in every country of the world. They don't call them embassies because the EU is not a country. They call them delegations or representations, and you can find a list by looking at that particular website there. And so if you do have a mate in Brazil, then your Brazilian mate can ring up the EC office in Brasilia and talk to them in Portuguese and find out what's going on, and get on my mailing list and so on and so forth. So that's one way of finding out what opportunities there are. But in many ways, I'm only going to spend a few minutes on this because I do think it's probably easier for people to add non-European partners via the transnational funds applications. However, very quickly, three programs. The first one is the IPA, Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance. This is the countries from the countries of the Balkans and Turkey who are hoping to join the European Union. There are different components that are applied to different countries. One is about cross-border cooperation. Number 5 is about rural development. There have been examples of projects involving, what tends to happen here is these are projects where, for example, they may decide they want to do something to help the culture sector become more innovative or imaginative or forward-thinking, and they will do that, and they will apply for some funding, and they'll involve some advisors and consultants and partners from the European Union member states. There was one a few years ago in Bulgaria and Romania, which was about rural cultural tourism, and they brought in some people who ran open-air museums and so on to help them develop their rural cultural tourism in the in the rural areas in Bulgaria and Romania. So that's the sort of project that might get funded. The neighbourhood countries, the ENPI, the European Neighbourhood Partnership Instrument, these are the countries around the EU that are less likely to join. There's the Euromed covering North Africa and the Middle East, and there's the Euro-East covering the former Soviet Union countries around the Caucasus. These have had programs for culture, media, and so on. But one interesting development is that these programs, these countries rather, are lobbying to become not just partners or potential partners as sort of like associated partners in the transnational funds, they're lobbying to become full partners And some of these countries have signed agreements now to be full partners in some transnational funds. So, over the years, I expect that many more of these countries will start to become eligible as full partners in the transnational funds as well. So another reason not to worry too much about this particular program. And finally, in the rest of the world, there's a lot of money that goes on culture projects through the aid budgets, would you believe? The Europe Aid program, which is run by the DG for Development Cooperation, the Europe Aid program has a commitment to culture. They've run conferences and supported projects and so on. They're particularly interested in the ACP countries, the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries. There's a website, acpcultures+.eu. They've supported projects such as PAMSI, which was PAMSI was very strange. It was really a performing arts touring subsidy scheme. They subsidized performing arts companies from these African, Caribbean, Pacific countries to come and tour around Europe. So all sorts of odd culture projects have been supported there. So that's just an overview of some of the opportunities that exist from these external action programs. Okay, we're just going to have a 2-minute break at this particular point. That's mainly so that I can go and replenish my cup of coffee. And then we will go on to the next session, which will look at the transnational funds. And what I will do in the meantime is I will just go back to the chat button, so that if you do have any questions at this stage, you've got a couple of minutes where you can ask these particular questions. And I'm just going to duck out of the room for 1 second and get myself another cup of coffee. I hope that's going to be acceptable, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes. So do feel free to send any questions in. I should have said that there is a time delay. After I speak, there's about a 40-second time delay before you hear what I've actually just said. But this is a chance for you to ask questions, and I'll answer them. I'll be back in just 1 minute when I've made a cup of coffee. Okay, see you shortly. Okay, I'm back. No questions. Everybody is happy. Everybody understands what's going on. Everybody. Okay. Well, in that case, we'll carry straight on then into the next part of the program. There's no chat messages. I just want to hope, I hope everybody is still there and still participating, but we'll go back to the program and we'll keep going. Okay, so we're now going to look at the transnational funds, okay? Transnational funds, these are programs such as these. I'm going to go through each one of these individually, so that's just a summary. Characteristics of the transnational funds. There are two types of grants in the transnational funds: projects and small-scale mobility activities. Projects based on cooperation and partnership, partners from at least three, usually at least three different countries. There have to be project grants. In other words, it's got to be very clear that these funds are not being used towards your annual revenue funding. That would be illegal. The EU cannot tread on the toes of the member states. It's obviously the job of the member states to provide annual revenue funding. So the EU can't get involved in that, but they can provide short-term projects. I mean, having said that, some projects can last for several years, so some projects can carry on for some time, but the principle is that they're short-term, time-limited projects. Mobility activities are usually smaller grants, around 1,500 euros, that an organisation can get for an individual to go and participate on a visit or an exchange or whatever it might be. And it is possible to apply for a group of mobility grants. So in a way, you could sometimes create projects by applying for a bunch of mobility grants. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we go through. So projects or mobility. Many of the transnational funds do provide support for both projects and mobility, but not everyone. So for example, the culture program only provides support for projects. It doesn't provide support for mobility, I'm afraid. A wide range of different themes and topics. There will be links to Europe 2020 agenda, as I've already indicated. And for projects, there will always be some match funding required. Although different programs have quite different stipulations about match funding. Some programs, like the culture program, are very clear. You have to demonstrate exactly where the match funding comes from and everything else. Other programs, they're a lot more flexible. You don't actually have to demonstrate that or give evidence that particular specific match funding has actually arrived. You just have to indicate that there was match funding somewhere for some part of the project. I know that sounds extraordinarily vague, but it is quite interesting. Some of these sub-programs, they are much less stringent about the match funding requirements than others. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. Right, transnational funds. These are the ones I'm going to look at. I'm not going to go through that list. You'll see that the range of budgets is huge divergence. I mean, 200 million euros for Europe for Citizens and nearly 80 billion euros for Horizon 2020. So there's a wide variation in these different transnational funds we're going to look at. Very briefly, the couple that I'm just going to sort of mention briefly and not spend too much time on. COSME, which is opportunities for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, to get support for their activities. I mention this because this is a fund run by the Directorate General for Enterprise in the European Commission, but the Directorate General for Education and Culture has been lobbying to make sure that this program takes into account the needs of the creative sector, and particularly the needs of creative businesses. So hopefully this is going to be more welcoming to applications and approaches from the cultural and creative sector in the future. It's the best people to talk to are the various Enterprise Europe contact points, and there are a number in the United Kingdom. They're not sort of linked to any particular geographical regions as we might otherwise know them, but you can find them. There's that website at the bottom, EEN.EC, Europa.eu, about branches, and you can find details of the local Enterprise Europe contact point on that particular website, and they can give you more information. And they do also run seminars, and you can ring them up and find out what's going on, if anything might be remotely relevant to the sort of work that you might be doing. Life Plus. Now, I mentioned Life Plus because it's an important program. It deals with climate change and the environment and so on. It has covered the natural heritage in the past, so projects which are about landscapes and gardens and other sort of outdoor heritage sites have sometimes got money from the Life program. In the UK, English Heritage has been a partner in a number of projects. Also, this is one of the programs where you'll see towards the bottom there, it says 80% of the funds have been devolved to member states. Now, this is quite interesting because I did mention earlier on that one of the differences between the structural funds and the transnational funds was that the structural funds, the money was devolved to the member states, but for the transnational funds, it was all kept in Brussels. There are, of course, some exceptions to this rule for the transnational funds. There are a couple of programs where it isn't all kept in Brussels, where what they have done is they've given some of the money to the individual contact points in the different member states. All of these programs have contact points within each of the member states. And for some of the programs, these contact points, which are normally, information and advice agencies, but in some programs, they have been given the additional responsibility of spending money, so providing grants as well. And this is one of those programs. So you'll see that there's a website there where you can find the information of the contact points in your own country. And then also I've given the details of the contact point here in the UK, which is an organization called Beta Europe. And you can contact them to find out what opportunities might exist there, and that's their website that's given there. But there is one other program which has devolved funding, one other transnational fund that has devolved funding, and we'll come to that. And that's, I think, particularly worth looking at, because it's fair to say that the devolved transnational funds are the easiest funds to access. So if you can find programs relevant to you that are devolved transnational funds, then you're in luck, because they are certainly the ones which are the easiest to apply to. Europe for Citizens. Now, Europe for Citizens is another program that is not devolved. You have to make applications to Brussels, but it's another program that I think, myself, is also incredibly easy to apply for. And the UK, most countries have been reasonably good at submitting applications. The UK has been woeful, pathetic. One of the problems with the UK is that there is no UK contact point for this program. Never has been, or actually there was for a little while, but there isn't one for the last few years. No likelihood of there being one in the foreseeable future. So nobody in the UK knows about this program. I think it's just waiting for applications to come from the UK. It's very easy to apply for, I think. It's a purely electronic application form. There's no other massive additional documentation. It's based on what is called lump sum financing. So you don't have to provide huge detail about budgets. It's just based on, the numbers of people involved and the numbers of partner countries and number of events you're doing and so on. And you just put all that together, and a calculation appears, and you suddenly say, well, they're going to give you 50,000 euros or 80,000 euros or 120,000 euros, whatever it might be. I think this is a really interesting opportunity. Okay. There are two main strands. This is the first strand, European Remembrance. The Europe for Citizens program, just I suppose to go back a little bit, the Europe for Citizens program exists to remind people of how we have got to where we are today with the European Union and where we might go in the future. So it's about the history, the context, the background, the terrible things that happened in the past, such as you'll see in the bullet point here about Nazism and the Holocaust and fascism and so on. But it's also about looking at what can be done to encourage tolerance, mutual understanding, intercultural dialogue, reconciliation. So that's one whole strand, which is this European Remembrance strand. And then the second strand, which I'll talk about in a second, is about civil society and democracy and engagement with the democratic process and getting people more involved in understanding and working with the European Union as it tries to achieve its goals and so on. But I think these programs are really open to a wild variety of interesting projects. So, okay. So this is the first strand, European Remembrance. This is a project-based strand here, okay? Different sorts of organizations can apply, including cultural organizations. I don't think I haven't said it here, but the Imperial War Museum was successful in the last round of this particular strand of Europe for Citizens. They got, I can't remember, 100,000 euros, I think, to do a small project on the basis of this particular strand. So, strand 2, as I said, democratic engagement and civic participation. And there are 3 sub-strands here. The first 2, town twinning and network of towns, are mobility strands. So these are small grants to bring people together. Okay. The town twinning is only open to twin towns, so you have to either be a town twinning association or a local authority, so that probably isn't relevant to most cultural organizations. Network of towns. It seems to me to be fairly straightforward. Set up a network of towns. If you've got a few contacts in a few different towns, and you can get together and have some sort of semi-formal agreement that you are now a network of towns, you can get your local authority to endorse that agreement as you are a network of towns. You can then apply, get some money, bring some people together. Now, these are small-scale grants to bring people together. So this is not, 100,000 euros to sort of run lots of projects, but it could be 20 or 30,000 euros to bring people together, to have some discussions and meetings and talk and meet people and all the rest of it. And finally, civil society projects. So this is a project strand, which again is stimulate and organize reflection, debate, or other activities related to the themes of the program, and propose concrete solutions that can be found through cooperation and coordination at the European level, and ensure a concrete link with the European Union policy-making processes. Now, although that sounds a bit narrow, I think it's actually rather broad, because this is about engagement and getting people to talk about what it's like to be citizens in different countries and what they feel about the European Union, and why they're not engaged, and how they might become more engaged in these goals and outcomes and everything else. I think there's some really interesting examples of opportunities within this particular program. Oops, I moved on. Sorry, didn't mean to press that button. So I do urge people, sign up for the Europe for Citizens webinar, find out much more about this. The deadlines are coming up in March. So that's a bit of a shame. You may not have enough time to put a project together for this particular year, but maybe in the future. But I think it's certainly worth looking at. I mean, just to give you the statistics, we did some analysis of who was applying, and other larger countries like Italy and France and so on. They had 700 or 800 successful applications in the last 7-year period. 700 or 800 successful applications. The UK in the same period had 186. So, we're just not applying. It's not that we write rubbish applications. Our success rate was good. 1 in 3 success rate. Great. We just don't put any applications in. Why not? What's going on? Okay. Horizon 2020. Horizon 2020. I'm sorry, I should stop there and go back and just check. Sorry, before we go on. People may be asking questions and I'm completely ignoring you. Here we are. Right, Trevelyan is still saying we're all still here. Great. Yes, Europe for Citizens. The next deadlines are the 2nd of March, I'm afraid. I am working on a project that is very last minute, that is putting an application for the 2nd of March. I'm happy, Trevelyan, if you want to sort of send me an email after this webinar with a summary of any ideas you might have in case you want to put an application in for the 2nd of March. But the deadlines are the 2nd of March for the project, for everything. Sorry, there's a deadline the 2nd of March for all the strands of Europe for Citizens. And there is also there will be a deadline in September or October for the mobility strand, so network of towns and the town twinning. There'll be a second deadline, but the projects, there won't be another deadline until March 2016, I'm afraid. So I hope that answers that question. Probably not what you wanted to hear, but there you go. Right, let's go back to these. Okay. Now, Horizon 2020. Now, Horizon 2020 is good news and bad news. The good news is this is the biggest budget known to humanity in the European Union. It is nearly 80 billion euros, so that's huge amounts of money. The bad news, however, is it covers everything to do with research and development and innovation. So whether you're talking about R&D in engineering or medicine or any other aspect of science, whatever it might be, it all comes under Horizon 2020. So once you start splitting it down into all that, 80 billion, isn't that fantastic? It's also complicated and challenging to apply for in many ways. Some aspects are actually slightly easier, but in many ways, it's a large-scale program looking for substantial, they want to give out grants of several million euros. So they are looking at large-scale applications that are submitted by universities or research institutes or government departments or large-scale, British Museum type of organizations. So you may have to join up with another organization to get involved, but I will just go through what is offered. There are 6 parts to the program. Part number 2, industrial leadership, and part number 3, societal challenges, are the 2 that are most relevant to the broad cultural sector. Number 2, industrial leadership, includes leadership in enabling and industrial technologies. This covers ICT, information communication technologies, and you'll see that there have been some calls for proposals. These, I've listed the ones both 2014 last year and 2015 this year. You'll see that there are a couple with deadlines coming up in I think it's May this year. Technologies for creative industry, social media and convergence, technologies for better human learning and teaching, and there'll be other calls for proposals in this strand in the future. Number 3, societal challenges. One of the strands here is on energy, clean and efficient energy, and last year there was a sub-strand on energy strategies and solutions for the deep renovation of historic buildings, interestingly. Under strand 3, there is also reflective societies, which covers cultural heritage and European identities. And there's a whole raft of project strands here, some of which were 2014 deadlines, some of which are 2015 deadlines. And these seem to cover a range of quite academic research projects like cultural opposition in the former socialist countries, and some that are much more practical, advanced 3D modeling for accessing and understanding European cultural assets. So, again, we're running a webinar on Horizon 2020. If you want more information on this particular program, you could come to the webinar. The next deadline is in April, May, June. I think it's May or June, I can't remember, I'm sorry. But you can find out more information in the webinar. It's complicated about how you participate. There are various websites that will help you. The UK website is h2020uk.org, which is there. And within each of the websites for each member state, there is then a whole raft of contact points. NCP, National Contact Point. There are many, many, many contact points because there are many, many strands for this huge program. So there is a contact point for reflective societies, and there's a contact point for ICT, and so on and so forth. So you can talk to these contact points and they can give you more advice and guidance, contact points within your own country about these particular programs. Don't forget Europeana. That's an interesting resource that the European Union is developing, and from time to time they do involve or do reach out to organizations across Europe. If you're not aware of Europeana, have a look at the website. It's a database of Europe's cultural heritage. So they have been digitalizing objects and items and archives and libraries and goodness knows what from museums and other organizations across Europe for the last 20 years. There's 20 million objects or something extraordinary number now available. And over the years, it's getting a bit better. It's getting interesting in terms of ways in which you can access a range of linked objects and items and access our extraordinary European cultural heritage. Erasmus Plus, right. Erasmus Plus. Now, Erasmus Plus puts the fear of God into people because it's actually a very large program. It covers not just the lifelong learning program, which was the previous program in this sort of area, but it also covers the previous Youth in Action program. So this is covering education and training, schools, vocational, higher, adult education, lifelong learning, and young people aged 13 to 30, and youth workers, in other words, those people working with young people. And it also covers sport. So it covers a wide range of areas, but in many ways it's quite simple, because there are essentially 3 strands of funding, and you only need to worry about 2, because the 3rd strand is about policy research, which I don't think is relevant at all to the cultural sector. Key Action 1 is mobility projects, so that's small grants to help people go somewhere. Key Action 2, projects. They're called strategic partnerships, but essentially they're projects. So it covers everything to do with education, training, young people, but it does it through a strand for mobility and a strand for projects. Okay, straightforward. Budget of 52.2 billion euros, and it's decentralized. We love Erasmus Plus. It has decentralized, okay? So what this means is that the funds have been handed back by the European Commission to the contact point in each of the member states. So you're not applying to Brussels, you are applying to the contact point in the UK, Denmark, Slovakia, wherever you happen to be. And this makes life so much easier. Unbelievable. It's the easiest funding, I keep saying. Okay, we'll come to that. Only organizations can apply for funding. Now, it used to be that if you wanted a single mobility grant, you could apply as an individual. You can't anymore. You would have to apply through some organization, your education provider or some other organization that was going to sort of put an application in on your behalf. And the final point, which is actually quite important, is this bottom point here about this middle ground. It's clear that there is Key Action 1, mobility, and Key Action 2, projects. But there is this middle ground where you can apply for 10 mobility grants all at once to create a sort of project based on the fact that the project is primarily focused on mobility. For example, I mean, Euclid, we did this a few years ago. We wanted to work with some partners in 3 other countries, and we all wanted to run a series of European cultural fundraising seminars. We wanted to do 1 weekend seminar in each of the 4 countries, and we wanted to send people from each country to all the other seminars. So, you know, the seminar in the UK, that people from Norway and Germany and Spain would all come to us. Then there'd be one in Norway, and the people from us and Germany and Spain would go to that, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, we could have applied for a project grant to run 4 seminars, but it was infinitely easier to simply apply for, I think, how many did we apply for? I think we applied for 15 mobility grants. In other words, to send 5 people from the UK to each of the other activities. And the joy about that was it was 1 application. We didn't have to write 15 mobility applications. It was 1 application, simple mobility application. We just wrote 15 as opposed to 1 mobility grant. Easy to fill in and financially unbelievably straightforward. Okay, it's a flat amount. You get a flat rate. They give you 1,500 euros, or roughly 1,500 euros per mobility. Okay, and you are not asked to provide as detailed a breakdown as you would be asked to provide for a project. What they're essentially interested in is the fact that the mobility happened. You're applying to send someone somewhere. Did they go? What did they learn? What was the result? Okay, they're not interested in the minutiae of how much you spent on this, that, and the other bus ticket. Okay, so it does give you flexibility about how you spend the mobility money. They may give you 1,500 euros per mobility. You may only spend, I mean, the way we worked it, to be honest, was we got 1,500 euros per mobility, and we spent, you know, maybe 200, 300 euros max on the flight and the accommodation and subsistence, and we used the rest of the money for each of the mobilities to pay to run our workshop. Okay? And providing, at the end of the day, we were able to demonstrate that everybody went on their mobilities, and it all happened, and everybody was happy, and there was a wonderful website, and so on and so forth, they paid the money. Not a problem. Okay, so I just share that one with you. Erasmus Plus does cover youth, young people aged 13 to 30, and they're people who work with young people, improving competences, skills, and employability of young people, promoting inclusion, social inclusion and well-being, fostering improvements in youth work and social policy, wide range of youth organisations, blah, 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 blah. Although only organisations can apply, you could create a sort of informal group of young people to submit the application. They're prepared to stretch the definition slightly if it's a youth-based application. Sport, there is also funding for sport, grassroots sports activities, mobility placements for sports apprentices, all sorts of odd things like that. Collaborative partnerships, not-for-profit European sports events, so probably not relevant, but just so you know, sport is included. So here we go, this is mobility. So the decentralised activities include all the mobility grants. So mobility for what you apply for is in one of these categories: higher education, vocational, school staff, adult education staff, young people and youth workers. I've highlighted adult education as, in terms of cultural organisations, it's unless you're working with young people, in which you'd apply under the youth strand. But if you're working with, if you're a museum or a theatre company and you have an outreach program, you work with the community, with disabled people, whatever it might be, that will come under the adult education banner. Okay, so cultural organisations are likely to apply either as adult education or youth. So you choose one of those and you put your mobility application. Projects, it's similar. Okay, decentralised, apply locally. You apply partnerships for one of those strands, adult education or young people, or you can mix them up. So you could apply for youth and adult education, for example. Okay, I'm not talking about the centralised activities because they're complicated and I don't think they are relevant, to be honest. So, in summary, the three strands, ignore strand 3, the policy reform one, strand 1, mobility, strand 2, projects. The national contact points for this program are all listed on that website there, and the UK contact point is Erasmus+.org.uk. It's a combination of the previous contact points for the 2 different programs. Ecoris, a consultancy based in Birmingham, a big consultancy based in Birmingham, and the British Council, who were the Youth in Action contact point. So they've come together and they've developed this website, Erasmus+.org.uk, which is pretty good. Gives you all the information you need. There are deadlines coming up in March. There will be deadlines later in the year for some of the programs. The youth deadlines are slightly different. I think their deadlines are in April. So youth deadlines in April. I think there was one that's just gone or is coming any day in February, April and October. But the other adult education, for example, other strands, the deadline are March and then September, October as well. Okay. So before we move on to Creative Europe, I'm just going to go back and see if there are any other questions, comments. Where do we find the calls? Right, you find the calls by coming to these webinars. No, you find the calls by visiting the website of the contact point, or by subscribing to various mailing lists, which I will talk about in a moment. There are mailing lists which do summarize all these calls, and I will mention those at the end of this seminar. Okay. Creative Europe. Okay, Creative Europe. Now, we've only got 10 minutes, and I'm, again, running a separate webinar on this on Monday, so do sign up for that if you would like to know more. Support program for cultural and creative sectors. There's no such thing as, people talk about the Creative Europe program. It's not really a program. It's an umbrella name for the existing culture program and media programs, and they're going to introduce this new thing called a financial facility. The financial facility will provide bank loans for the sector. So that's the new 3rd strand. The culture program is carrying on similarly to before. Media program is carrying on similar to before. And there will be this new 3rd strand, this financial facility bank loan program, which will come in 2016. You'll see the total budget, $1.5 billion, mostly to the media program, $455 million to culture, and a bit to the new financial facility. It's not much, but it has actually gone up. Believe it or not, this program, Creative Europe budget, is actually bigger than the total budget was in the previous round, so that's a good thing. The final bullet point just reinforces what I said at the very beginning, that once upon a time, culture program was about supporting nice culture projects, particularly if you were a fine art museum or an opera house or an orchestra. These days, it's much more broadly based, which is good, but it's also linked to the Europe 2020 agenda. So they are looking at projects which link in with the job creation potential of the sectors, capacity building, the digital agenda, innovation, and so on and so forth, as you will see as we talk about the criteria. One thing to just bear in mind is that the definition of cultural and creative sector is incredibly broad these days. All sectors whose activities are based on cultural values and artistic and other creative expressions, whether they are market or non-market oriented, that's important. What that is saying is that you can involve profit-making organizations in your partnership. Obviously, the projects can't make a profit, but you may want to involve a profit-making partner to give an extra interesting dimension to your project. Whatever the type of structure that carries them out, irrespective of how it is financed. It covers the value chain, all the different stages and so on of activity, and also related functions like education, management, and so on. Gives you an example of all the different areas covered under the culture program, including architecture, archives, libraries, crafts, audio-visual, video games, blah-de-blah-de-blah, all sorts of things. If you apply to the culture program, the only caveat is if you apply to the culture program, you can't have a project that is only focused on the audio-visual sector. It has to be broader than that. Okay. Financial facility, I've said all this already, I think. There has been a production guarantee fund in the media program, so they're now expanding this to cover not just the media sector, but also the culture and creative sector as well, more broadly. They want to generate €1 billion worth of loans. What the idea is, it will provide you with an additional guarantee. So you can go take the guarantee. What the idea is that you would go to your bank to get your loan, and the bank would normally say, no, we're not giving you a loan because you don't have assets or collateral. And the idea is that they will now give you a loan because you will have a guarantee from the European Commission for this particular loan you're applying for. So you have to apply for the guarantee first and then go and get your loan from the bank. We'll see. Details are still a little bit vague, but it's due out to start 2016, so we'll see what happens. Media program. Media program is supporting the audiovisual sector, films, television, games. It doesn't cover, it's a minor focus on production. It's mainly focused on helping projects get started, so the development of projects, the capacity building for people working in the sector, and then it does the other end. So it helps projects get seen more, so distribution, dissemination, film festivals, and so on and so forth. There is a new strand, the second last bullet point, for international co-production. So this is about co-production, that they will put some money into co-productions, but they have to be on an international basis involved in the co-production. And the final bullet point, audience development. This is a new theme for the Creative Europe program that applies not just to media, but also to the culture program. Really important. It's a real flavor of the month buzz phrase. You really do need to address audience development in these program applications to the Creative Europe programs. There are lots and lots of different strands in the media program, audience development, cinema networks, festivals, so on and so forth. There are lots, and they give out lots of smaller grants. That's why there's so many strands, and they have, at least one, if not two, calls per year for each of these different strands. If you just simply contact the contact point, you can get the information on what strands are coming up and available. There is in theory, a combined Creative Europe desk in each member state who is the contact point, and you can find details from that website. In most countries, as in the UK, they've split their Creative Europe desk there's one for the media program and one for the culture program. The Creative Europe desk for the media program in the UK is the BFI. That's their website, mediadeskuk.eu. That's their email. There are also separate contacts in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So that's the media program. Culture program. Okay. The culture program objectives. There are just three. Okay, there are only three objectives of the culture program. Helping the sectors operate transnationally and internationally, promoting circulation of works and the mobility of players. Circulation of works and mobility of players are the underpinning themes that have been there since the year .-1. So they are the areas which you really do need to make sure you focus on. The second bullet point is audience development. Big issue, as I keep saying. reaching new audiences, improving access, focusing on disadvantaged groups, innovative ways with audiences to retain and enlarge them, and so on. Big thing, audience development. And then innovation and creativity, artistic innovation, testing of new business models, using digital technologies, innovative spillovers. I'll talk more about this at the webinar in detail on Monday, but you can see the sorts of the 3 objectives. Those are the only 3 objectives. Then there are 6 priorities, and each culture project would be asked to address at least one of these 6 priorities. The first one is focused on providing players with skills, competencies, and know-how, so they can help them adapt to the digital technologies, audience development, and so on. The second one is helping them cooperate internationally. The third one is about access to professional opportunities. The fourth one is about supporting international cultural activities. This is the most common one: exhibitions, performances, exchanges, festivals. The fifth one is circulation of European literature. There's always one on literature because that's always under-resourced. And the sixth one is the same thing as what was in the objectives. In other words, audience development. So again, big thing, audience development. The strands within the culture program, the main strand, which is most relevant, is the top row there, projects. So the culture program supports big projects and small projects, and that takes 70% of the budget. So that's the most important in terms of priority, financial priority. There's also support for literary translation. There is support for European cultural platforms, which is a slightly peculiar one, but there is some money for that. And there is support for European cultural networks and a few special actions. Networks really just is European networks, so that's not going to apply. I think most people will be applying for projects. If you're a publisher, you might apply for literary translation. Platforms is slightly different, and I'll explain that during the in detail webinar. In terms of projects then, just to sort of summarize, small projects and big projects. Small projects have a minimum total of 3 partners, the leader and 2 co-organizers. Large projects a total of 6, 1 plus 5, from 3 different countries, from 6 different countries. Small projects, you can get no more than €200,000, which is 60% of the budget. So you need to find the other 40% of match funding. Large projects, you can get up to 2 million, that's on the basis of 50-50, so you would find 2 million of match funding, which may be a challenge. Projects can last for up to 4 years, you'll see, and you can add in additional partners, as I was saying earlier. Partners can come from almost anywhere. Member states, 28 member states. Other countries, if they've signed an agreement, these are the other countries which have some links with the European Union, either because they're part of the economic area, like Norway and Iceland, or they're applying to join the European Union, like Albania, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Turkey, or they are these neighborhood countries that I said earlier that are trying to get more involved, and some of them have signed these new agreements, Georgia and Moldova. But you can also have associate partners anywhere in the world, and you can spend up to 30% of the budget on these other partners. So if you want a partner for the United States or Uruguay or Uganda or anywhere else beginning with you, you can have a partner from these countries, and you can spend up to 30% of the budget on their involvement. The applications is announced in July. Deadline first Wednesday in October. You're informed March next year. You can choose your start date as being between May and December of that year, and you then add 1 to 4 years on to get your end date. So that's the sort of timetable you're looking at. The UK Creative Europe desk is managed by the British Council. That's their new website, creativeeuropeuk.eu. That's their email address, and again, there are separate contacts in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So that summarizes the Creative Europe Culture Programme, and there'll be more detail in the webinar that I'm running on Monday. Next steps. If you want to find more information, we have a Twitter feed, which we tweet regularly with all the news about European funding opportunities, including dates, deadlines, upcoming events, and so on and so forth, information you might need to know. But of course, all the different contact points of Creative Europe desks and all the rest of them have their own newsletters and updates. And you are, of course, welcome to sign up for those. These are all free. Do consider the various opportunities. Decide how ready you are, which deadline is right for you. At the end of the day, and I'll keep saying this in the individual webinars, it's a really good idea, and the great partners are the 2 key factors that are going to swing it for you. Okay, and your good idea has to evolve in conjunction with your partners. Okay, you will have a good idea to start with, no doubt, but you'll need to share that with your partners and take on board their comments and suggestions. As I've said, free updates via Twitter. We run seminars and these webinars. We can provide additional information. Obviously, we're independent, so there is a fee for the additional services we provide, but we do help people write applications if they wish to have that service. And if you're a Connexus member, there is additional information which we make available for download, and you get additional benefits such as free access to our webinars and so on. And that's it. There's my contact details. Please feel free to send me an email if you so wish after this is over, in case you want to find out more information about anything. Okay, right, I've finished. That's it. We've gone a bit over the 2:30 limit. I'm sorry about that. 3:30 in Brussels and Košice and anywhere else in Europe. Are there any final questions? I will just stay online for a minute or so, a couple of minutes more, in case anybody has any chat questions they wish to send to me. If you do want to send me an email after this is all over, then please, of course, feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to reply to those emails if they are, short, simple questions which I can answer easily. So I'm just going to hang on now for a few moments and see if anybody has any questions. Thank you for participating today. I know several of you signed up for all 5 webinars, you gluttons for punishment. So I will see some of you, or hear. I won't see you at all. You'll see me at the webinars next week. So I'm just going to hang on now, but do feel free to log off if that's all you want. I think there are no more questions, so I think I will probably log off this webinar now. If you do want to send me an email, please do so. Otherwise, we'll communicate on the webinars next week. So thank you very much, and it's goodbye from me. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.